All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep into the mind of someone you might not know right off the bat, but trust me, this guy's a philosophical heavyweight. We're talking about Francisco Suárez, lived from 1548 to 1617. And get this, even titans like Leibniz, Grotius, Grotius, international law guy, and Schopenhauer, heck, even Heidegger, they all found something worthwhile in Suárez's work. Grotius even said Suárez was, and I quote, hardly unequaled. So for our listeners out there, the ones who love getting philosophical, this is your chance. We're going to hang out with a thinker who really laid down some groundwork. A thinker whose ideas, they're kind of baked into the way we think in the West, even if we don't realize it.
Yeah, it's like he's part of the philosophical plumbing, To really get why Suárez is still relevant today, we got to put him in his time. We're talking about the Second Scholastic period. That's the 16th and 17th centuries. It was a time when philosophy and theology were having a real revival, going back to the roots, guys like Aquinas and Scotus. But Suárez, he stands out. And for folks who are into philosophy, he's really interesting because he was so systematic. He didn't just dabble. He went deep on everything. Metaphysics, how we understand God, the mind, ethics, politics, law, you name it. He had something to say about it. And he wasn't afraid to shake things up and offer totally new ways of looking at these big questions.
So, today's mission for all you philosophical adventurers out there is to explore the heart of Suárez's metaphysics. We're going to pull out some of his most mind-bending ideas, the ones that are still sparking debates in philosophy today. His take on nominalism, that's a big one, goes straight to how we understand abstract ideas. Then there's his theory of causation, incredibly detailed, lots of twists and turns there. And we can't forget about his concept of beings of reason. How can we even think about stuff that doesn't exist? That's what he tackles. And we'll even touch on how his metaphysics connects to his ideas about God. We want you to walk away with a good understanding of what Suárez brought to the table and why it mattered back then, and honestly, why it should still matter to anyone thinking about these issues now.
Exactly. It's like digging into this hidden code that's running under so many philosophical conversations we're having today. You'll see those questions that keep you up at night, like, are universals real? What is cause and effect, really? How can we think about what's not there? Suárez was already wrestling with these things centuries ago, and seeing how he approached them, well, it might just give you a whole new angle on those same puzzles today.
So who was this guy? Where did he come from? Let's rewind the clock. Francisco Suárez was born in Granada, Spain, back in 1548. And here's a little tidbit. His path to intellectual stardom wasn't exactly a straight shot. Imagine that. He was initially rejected by the Jesuits. They thought, maybe not the sharpest tool in the shed. Thank goodness they changed their minds because he ended up becoming one of their most brilliant thinkers. Even after he joined, though, it took a while for his philosophical and theological genius to really shine.
And the world he came from, it was buzzing with ideas. The Iberian Peninsula was a hotbed for scholasticism, and Francisco de Vitoria was a big name in that movement. Suárez was right in the thick of it. And get this, his ideas didn't just stay in Spain. Jesuit missionaries were spreading them all over the place. I mean, we're talking Europe, the Americas, Japan, China, the Philippines, India, you name it. They even tried to translate his big book, Metaphysical Disputations, into Chinese. That's how far-reaching his influence was.
Talk about a global philosophy. And back in Europe, Suárez was right in the middle of all the intellectual action. He went to the best universities, Salamanca and Coimbra, eventually becoming a professor. Funny thing, though, he wasn't a great preacher. Apparently, he'd get so lost in the weeds of theology, people's eyes would glaze over. But as a teacher, he was a rock star. He didn't just repeat what everyone else said. He went back to the source, dug into the core of philosophical problems, and looked at them with fresh eyes.
Of course, when you're that original, you're bound to ruffle some feathers. Some people, even within the Jesuits, they thought he was straying too far from Aquinas, There were even whispers about a separate Suárezista school of thought opposed to the Thomists. Suárez, though, he tried to downplay those divisions. He thought they were making things more complicated than they needed to be. Oh, and he had a bit of a rivalry going on with another big thinker, Gabriel Vasquez. They went back and forth, debating ideas, and you know what? Their followers kept it going even after they died. That's how heated these philosophical battles were back then.
And he wasn't just an armchair philosopher either. He jumped right into the political debates of his day, wrote these powerful treatises, like he defended the church against the Venetian Republic, and he even wrote a whole book pushing back against King James I of England, who wanted all his Catholic subjects to swear an oath of allegiance. That book, Defensio Fidei, it caused a real uproar. He went deep on political power, and some people saw it as straight up challenging the king's authority. They even burned copies of it in London and Paris. Talk about philosophical ideas having real-world consequences.
Right. And all this just shows you how wide-ranging his interests were. It wasn't just abstract ideas. He cared about how those ideas played out in the real world. Eventually, he landed a sweet gig at the University of Coimbra, appointed by King Philip II of Spain, no less. That says something about his reputation. And the guy was a writing machine. As some estimates say, he wrote like 21 million words. That's more than twice what Aquinas wrote. And it wasn't just his own stuff. He edited other works, too. People were so hungry for his ideas that unauthorized copies of his books were popping up all over Europe as soon as they were published.
And for us philosophy nerds, the real goldmine is his book, Metaphysical Disputations, published in 1597. This thing's a beast. It's like the ultimate guide to metaphysics. Suárez lays out everything that came before him, analyzes it, picks it apart, and then he throws in his own original ideas. And those ideas, they had a huge impact. Even Schopenhauer, not exactly known for being a cheerleader, called it an authentic compendium of the whole scholastic tradition. That's high praise.
And it's not just the size, it's how it's organized. This book is meticulously structured. He breaks it down into 54 disputations, each one like a mini-book on a specific metaphysical topic. And he's not just quoting Aristotle and Aquinas, though they're definitely in there a lot. Suárez is his own thinker, taking all this tradition and building something new and exciting on top of it.
So when you open up the disputations and see how he defines metaphysics, it might seem kind of narrow at first. He says it's the study of being insofar as it is real being. But when he starts unpacking what that means, you realize it covers so much. It's basically all the stuff that keeps metaphysicians busy even today.
Yeah, and even though he talks about real being, the way he understands it is actually super broad. It includes these fundamental categories of being, and then those properties that go beyond those categories, like unity, truth, goodness, what we call the transcendentals. And then there's the whole difference between finite being and infinite being. And get this, he even throws in beings of reason, those things that don't actually exist. He says we can't understand what it means to be without thinking about these non-existent things too, like made-up creatures, negations, abstract ideas, the whole shebang.
The book itself, it's like a roadmap through his whole system. It starts with the most general ideas about being, then moves into the transcendentals, those properties of being I mentioned. Then we get into causes, the different types of causes, the big difference between finite and infinite being, then the nature of finite things, substance, and accidents. And he goes deep on the 9 categories of accidents. And finally, the grand finale, beings of reason. It's like a grand tour of metaphysics, according to Suárez.
Totally. And we obviously can't go through all 54 disputations in our time here, but by looking at some of his key ideas, his most distinctive arguments, I think we can give our listeners, especially those who are philosophically inclined, a real sense of how original and just how deep his metaphysics was.
So let's jump into one of the biggest debates Suárez was involved in. Nominalism. Basically, Suárez was convinced that only individual things really exist. For him, reality out there in the world, it's made up of singular things. He even says formal unity as it exists in a thing is incommunicable, meaning nothing outside our minds is actually shared by more than one individual thing. So no universals hanging out in the world independent of our minds. Suárez is picking a side in a fight that's been going on in philosophy for ages.
And this idea, this nominalism, is like the bedrock of his whole system. It affects how he approaches so many other questions, like what are properties? What are relations? What's the basic structure of reality? Big stuff. But here's the thing. If you read him carefully, you might find places where he seems to contradict himself. Like he'll say that what we call universals truly exist in reality. It can be pretty confusing. You need to understand the philosophical challenges that nominalists like him were facing back then, especially with everyone still taking Aristotle so seriously.
Yeah, at first glance, it's like, wait a minute, he's all about individual things, and then he's saying universals are real. But that's where we have to remember that Aristotelian science was still the dominant paradigm, and it relied heavily on these logical proofs, demonstrations that started with universal premises. The problem for a nominalist is, if those premises are truly universal, they have to be about universals, right? They're about properties or essences that lots of individuals share. So Suárez, even though he's all about nominalism, he can't just ignore universals. They're baked into how science works. He has to find a way to make it all fit together.
Exactly. So instead of just ditching nominalism because it was getting tricky, Suárez comes up with a solution, and honestly, it's pretty ingenious. He says, all right, only individual things have real formal unity in themselves, But our minds, they can form general concepts. We do it all the time. And we base those general concepts on the similarities we see between individual things. Those concepts, those are what we usually call universals, and they don't exist as real things out there in the world. They're what he calls extrinsic denominations.
It's like a mind game, right? He's not saying we just make up the similarities we see, it's all subjective. No, he says that when we use a universal term correctly, like when we say both Socrates and Plato are human, we're doing it right because there's a real similarity between them in reality. Our minds aren't making that up. They're picking up on something that's already there. But, and this is where the nominalism comes back in, this doesn't mean there's some big universal thing called humanity that they both share or participate in. For Suárez, the universal is a being of reason and ens rationis. It's like a label that we apply based on those real similarities between individual things.
Yeah, he's super careful about this. He's not saying universals are totally made up, but they're not separate things either. It's more about how our minds work, how we group things together based on how they're alike. He even says nature and essence are multiplied as many times as there are individuals. So each individual thing has its own unique essence or nature, and the universals we use, they're just tools for our thinking.
That's a pretty neat trick. He acknowledges that we need universals to think and talk, especially when we're doing science, but he keeps them grounded in the realm of real individual things. The universal, for Suárez, is a being of reason, an ens rationis, and it comes from those individual things and how our minds understand them. It's a really interesting way to think about how individuals and universals relate to each other.
Totally. And whether or not you buy into his whole argument, you got to understand this commitment to nominalism. It's key to getting how he approaches other big metaphysical issues, like his whole theory of causation, which is what we should probably dive into next.
Right, causation. It's central to Suárez's metaphysics, just like it was for Aristotle. Suárez says if you really want to understand something, you got to get its causes. So as a metaphysician, someone trying to figure out being in its most basic form, he spends a lot of time in the disputations breaking down the different causes of being.
And just like Aristotle, Suárez works with four main types of causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. But he emphasizes this really important distinction between what a cause is in its essence and how it actually causes something, how it brings about its effect. He says you can know something is a real cause even if you don't totally get the mechanism, the whole process of how it produces its effect. It's like a doctor can be the cause of a patient's health, even if we don't understand every little thing that happens in the body when the doctor treats them.
Exactly. So for Suárez to understand being, you have to start with what brings being about in the first place, the big picture, and then we can look at how those causes work to bring specific things into existence or change them in some way.
Right. And he gives this really broad definition of a cause, a principle that in its own right imparts being to something else. He also says it's about giving or communicating being to another thing. This whole imparting being thing might sound a little weird, but he basically means making something come into existence or changing something that already exists. It's about creating or transforming.
And from there, he goes into each of the four causes in a lot of detail. He breaks them down into internal causes. Those are the material cause and the formal cause. They're like the ingredients of the thing itself, like the bronze of a statue, that's the material cause, and the shape of the statue, that's the formal cause. And then there are external causes, which are the efficient cause and the final cause. Those act on the thing from the outside. The sculptor who shapes the bronze, that's the efficient cause. And the sculptor's artistic goal, the purpose of the statue, that's the final cause.
What's really amazing about Suárez's take on causation is how deep he goes, how much detail and nuance he adds to the discussion. Like, can you imagine comparing David Hume's later, more simplified definition of cause, just constant conjunction without any necessary connection, to the intricate analysis that Suárez gives us in the disputations? I mean, Suárez spends whole disputations just teasing apart each type of cause, and he even throws in these fascinating side discussions about things like necessity and contingency, free will, even God's freedom in creation when he's talking about efficient causality.
It's all connected to his big metaphysical project, trying to understand the foundations of reality. He's willing to explore all sorts of hypothetical situations, even impossible ones, just to get at the subtle distinctions between these key metaphysical concepts. That's how he rolls.
Absolutely. And if we want to understand what makes Suárez's approach unique, we should really zero in on two specific types of causes: formal causation and final causation. Those are where he really gets into it with the Aristotelian tradition, but he also adds his own original twists and insights.
So let's start with formal causation and Suarez's defense of substantial forms. Now, he defines a substantial form as a definite, simple, and incomplete substance, which, as the actuality of matter, constitutes with it the essence of a composite substance. What's interesting here is that he really emphasizes that it's the substantial form working together with matter that makes up the essence of any composite substance. He's giving matter its own causal power, its own role in creating things, and that sets him apart from some other scholastic thinkers who thought matter was totally dependent on the form.
Yeah, that emphasis on matter's own causal power, that's a key difference. But what's really going to strike a modern philosopher, especially someone who knows a bit about early modern philosophy, is that he's still hanging on to this whole idea of substantial forms. I mean, after Locke and all those criticisms, it seems kind of outdated, right? Locke basically said substantial forms are just gibberish, that we can't even imagine what they are.
And the funny thing is, Suarez knew this criticism was coming. He even admits that we can't directly experience substantial forms. He says, the first reason for doubting that substantial forms exist is that they cannot be known by any experience. He's not afraid to say, hey, maybe we have good reason to doubt they're real.
But here's the crucial part. He doesn't follow Locke and the empiricists and just reject substantial forms because we can't see them. He says, hold on, they're actually necessary to explain certain things we do experience. His argument is like, look, we see these patterns in the world, and the best way, maybe even the only way, to explain them is to say that substantial forms exist. They're the missing piece of the puzzle.
So what are these patterns that need substantial forms to explain them? Well, he points to a few things. First, how can so many different properties exist together in one thing? Like Socrates, he's got all these different characteristics, but he's still one unified individual. Second, how do we explain the hierarchy of properties? Essential properties seem to be more fundamental than accidental ones. Third, how do things come into being and then stop existing as the specific things they are? How does substantial change happen? And finally, how do things stay in balance? Especially living things, they're amazing at maintaining their internal order and bouncing back after being disrupted.
Take Socrates again. He's clearly not just a random jumble of stuff. He's a unity. He persists through time. He exists in a specific place. He's clearly human. What makes him all of that? Suarez says it's his substantial form, the form of being human. That's what unifies all his different properties and makes him the kind of being he is.
So he's basically saying if we want to understand how the world is made up of different types of things, we need this idea of an underlying principle of unity and organization, and that's the substantial form. And like you said, he's aware of the objections, he sees them coming, and he tries to ground the existence of substantial forms not in what we can observe directly, but in their explanatory power. It's a pretty smart move.
All right, so let's move on to final causation. Now, Suarez admits right off the bat that this one is a bit more obscure and harder to wrap our heads around compared to the other types of causes. Even Aristotle struggled with it a bit. Suarez acknowledges that there are good reasons to be skeptical about whether an end, something that might not even exist yet, can actually cause something to happen.
He even brings up this doubt himself. Like, if the final cause, let's say the mythical fountain of youth, doesn't actually exist, how can it possibly cause anything to happen? He then goes on to list 6 major objections to final causation that were being debated by scholastic thinkers at the time. They question whether an end can really be considered a starting point, a source of being, whether it can actually give being to something else. They bring up the idea that it's circular, a form being its own end, the problem of an end not actually doing anything, just being a goal. And then there's the whole issue of natural things seemingly acting towards ends without any intention. And finally, it's just not clear what final causality is really about, its object and nature. These objections get right to the core of the philosophical problems with trying to fit teleological explanations that involve goals and purposes, into our understanding of reality.
Despite all these tricky objections, Suarez holds firm. He says final causation is real, it's important, but he does make a big concession. He argues that final causes mainly work through the intentions of thinking beings. He famously says that the end is last in terms of actually happening, but it's first in the order of intention, and it's this being intended or willed that makes it a real cause.
So he's saying that in the natural world where things don't have intentions, final causation doesn't really apply in the same way. Things might seem to act in goal-directed ways, but for Suarez, final causes are mostly about explaining psychological stuff, especially intentional actions, things we do on purpose. The end has to be something an agent thinks about and wants in order for it to be a real final cause.
Think about someone going to the grocery store to buy milk. The goal, the final cause, is to get that milk. Now let's say they get to the store and there's no milk. The fact that they went to the store, that action was still caused by their desire to buy milk, even though they didn't actually get it. Suárez says that the efficient cause of their action was their desire for the milk, combined with their belief that they could buy it at the store. But that desire, it's specifically a desire for the end of buying milk. So the efficient cause, their desire, is tied to the final cause, the goal.
And that leads to his big point about final causation. In order for an end to cause, it is altogether necessary that it be cognized in advance. So the end has to be something that's thought about beforehand, that's intended. This basically limits final causation to the realm of conscious thought and intention. For Suárez, something that's not apprehended or intended, it can't really be a cause.
Yeah, it seems like he's narrowing the scope of final causation, but this move allows him to defend the importance of teleological explanation, explanations that involve goals and purposes when it comes to things like rational action and intention.
Right.
But like you said, it does raise a question. If a final cause has to be something someone thinks about, something they intend, but it doesn't actually exist in the real world like that fountain of youth, how can it still be a real cause with real effects? And this is where Suárez's theory of beings of reason, or entity comes into play.
This is where he tackles that big philosophical question. How can we even think and talk about things that aren't real? His discussion of entity is super insightful, and it's still relevant for philosophers today who are trying to figure out intentionality, reference, and the whole question of whether non-existent things and abstract concepts actually have any kind of being.
And his category of entity is pretty broad. It's not just imaginary creatures like griffins or impossible goals like the Fountain of Youth. It includes negations, like not human, privations, like blindness, logical abstractions, like the idea of a consequent in logic, and even, because he's a nominalist, general categories like species and genus. Remember, for Suárez, only individuals really exist. So these general categories, they're useful for thinking and talking, but they're not real things in themselves.
What's really interesting and maybe a little counterintuitive is that Suárez is adamant that anti-rationists don't actually exist. He's not saying they exist in a different way or to a lesser degree. He's saying they just don't exist in the same way as real things, but we clearly think and talk about them all the time.
Oh.
So the puzzle is, how does that work? How can our thoughts and words be about things that aren't real?
Well, Suárez says that when we think or talk about a being of reason, we're basically acting as if it existed. Our thought itself is real. It's a real mental state with real content. But that content ultimately comes from a real structure in our minds, a real concept, not from some object out there in the world. The objective being of an ens rationis, it's not a real thing itself, but it's based on a real thing, a real structure in our minds. It borrows its intelligibility from the realm of real being.
It's like when I imagine a griffin. That act of imagining is a real event. It's a real mental state. But the griffin itself, it's not out there in the world. It's different from when I think about a real person, like Socrates. In that case, my thought creates an extrinsic denomination in a real individual. But with the griffin, there's no extrinsic denomination because there's no real griffin to be denominated.
Exactly. The cause and effect chain stops in my mind with the concept of the griffin. There's no real griffin being created or changed outside my mind. This helps Suárez explain how the Fountain of Youth, which doesn't exist, can still be a final cause for Ponce de Leon. It was something he really thought about and desired, even though it wasn't real. The causal power is in his intention, in the content of his thought, which can be directed towards something that doesn't exist.
It's a pretty clever way to connect our thoughts in the real world, even when we're thinking about unreal things. It shows how powerful our minds are, how we can be motivated by things that aren't even there.
And this whole framework is important for his ideas about God, too, though we only have time to touch on that briefly. Suárez was very clear. God is a real being, not just a being of reason, not something we made up. He also believed that we can use reason, without relying on any religious revelation, to understand God's nature and attributes.
Right. He dedicates 2 whole disputations in the disputations to proving God's existence and then exploring what God is like. He talks about God's perfection, infinitude, simplicity, immensity, all the big stuff. He says that, yeah, we need revelation to fully understand God, but reason can get us pretty far. We can reason from the effects we see in the world, that's a posteriori reasoning, or we can deduce things about God based on other things we already know about him. That's a priori reasoning.
And when it comes to God's perfection, Suárez gets very specific. He distinguishes between privative perfection, that means being complete, lacking nothing that's essential to your nature, and absolute perfection, which means having every possible perfection. He argues that God is perfect in both senses. For example, he says God's simplicity means he's privatively perfect because a being without parts can't be missing anything. And he gives both a posterior arguments based on the fact that the world we see is contingent and a priori arguments based on God being the first cause and the absolutely necessary being to show that God must have all the perfections we see in created things, but in a much more perfect way.
He's careful to point out, though, that when we say God has perfections that creatures also have, we don't mean he has them in the exact same way. He distinguishes between absolute perfections, which are part of God's essence, and what he calls secundum quid perfections, which might have limitations or be inappropriate for God's nature.
When we talk about God's absolute perfections, we're using analogy, trying to understand something infinite through our limited, finite minds.
This just shows how connected all of Suárez's ideas are. He takes his whole metaphysical framework with its distinction between real being and beings of reason, and he applies it to understanding God. His goal was to create a complete rational picture of reality, from the most basic principles of being all the way to the nature of God himself.
So to sum up our deep dive into Suárez for all you philosophy fans out there, we explored his version of nominalism, his theory of causation, which is super detailed and nuanced, his fascinating take on beings of reason, which helps us understand how we can even think about things that don't exist. And we even touched on how all this connects to his ideas about God. The big takeaway here is that Suárez is a model of philosophical rigor. He shows us what it means to really grapple with the most fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, and reality. And even if you don't agree with everything he says, which is totally fine, engaging with his arguments will definitely make you a sharper thinker. Like his whole exploration of how we talk about what isn't real, that's still a hot topic in philosophy today.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about. Suárez says our understanding of universals depends on how our minds work. How does that affect how you think about categories, classification systems, even language itself? And what about his theory of causation? Does it offer any insights into current debates about agency, scientific explanation, the nature of reality?
Remember, Metaphysical Disputations, his big book, is massive. We've just scratched the surface here. If you found any of this interesting, I'd encourage you to go deeper, read more of Suárez, explore the world of second scholasticism. You might be surprised at how relevant these debates from centuries ago still are today.